the marketing from big tobacco companies just completely destroyed this really amazing substance called nicotine. Even some of these nicotine patches, we found that there's formaldehyde in those. And there can be heavy metals and there can be nickel, things that help preserve some of the shelf life of it. And nicotine influences a wide variety of cognitive function like attention, learning, and memory. And it's also been found to improve cognitive impairment in these chronic diseases, like I mentioned before, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and then age-associated memory impairment. I get so frustrated when you see, I have clients who have kids. It's so deceptive because it's got this cloud of like this nice cotton candy or whatever the sweet smell is. And the vape it helps kids who have ADHD. It's just a trap that kids get stuck in where they're using this really negative type of nicotine that does have formaldehyde, it does have heavy metals, and that's when it becomes a lot more addictive, is when you have other chemicals combined with the nicotine. I've been getting asked a lot more, now more than I've ever seen, is about nicotine. You can't just nicotine's bad and it's all like, oh no, I can't believe we're talking about this. But actually there's some really interesting research on it. I actually had a couple of my clients today ask about nicotine. There can be some weird stigmas around nicotine, rightfully so, because we had the marketing from big tobacco companies just completely destroyed this really amazing substance called nicotine. And nicotine, if you look up, some of the things that nicotine does is stimulates dopamine, acetylcholine. It's really good for memory, good for performance. Some of the best writers in the world, authors, they were chain smokers. I'm not advocating smoking at all. I'm not even advocating nicotine. This is where you need to have a one-on-one conversation. But even before you have that one-on-one conversation, I think we need to talk about what the downsides are and actually how you can maximize your potential with it, what it's being used for. Because from what I can tell, there's a lot of things going on. There's things that are really helpful and accurate on nicotine. And then there's people who are, throwing nicotine patches on and probably too high of a dose for too long. And they're having some diminishing returns. But I got very interested in this, and we've talked about it a little bit on the hack, but got very interested in it when I learned about using nicotine for long haul COVID. And that was the resurgence of it. My first foray with nicotine, outside of trying chewing tobacco in high school. I don't know if any of you tried that. I remember I tried some Copenhagen. I had a friend who I just thought he was the coolest guy, super tough. And then, what he did is he gave me some of his Copenhagen. He's like, all right, just put a little chew in. And so I remember I got home and I was probably 14 or 15 at the time. And I was so excited to try it. And I put a little chew, just like he told me, in my bottom lip. And I was in the backyard of my house, so my parents couldn't see me. And then the whole world started to spin. And I was throwing up. And that was a good lesson that this is not for me, tobacco. And so I've always been adverse to it. But then Ben Greenfield came to the office about 10 years ago, and he had these nicotine toothpicks. And I'm like, what are those? And he's like, oh, nicotine toothpicks. And he's like, a little microdose of it is really helpful when I'm riding. And, he's a great rider and really into fitness. And so I tried that and I was like, wow, this is pretty interesting. And so started looking at some of the research, and I just uncovered the fact that, man, not only is nicotine really good for clearing out viruses and really good for dopamine and memory, but it's a great preventative strategy when it comes to things like Alzheimer's. And so as we go through this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say not all nicotine is created equal. This is not medical advice. This you need to do at your own, through your own discretion. I'm going to try to give you some do's and don'ts in as short of time as possible. But you want to be very careful on the source of the nicotine, because even some of these nicotine patches, we found that there's formaldehyde in those. And there can be heavy metals and there can be nickel, things that help preserve some of the shelf life of it. And so be very careful where you get it. So I can talk to you about, kind of some sources that you can try. There's patches that you can try. And, and then if you decide to go down that road, start very, very slow. So let's talk about, kind of the big downsides of nicotine. And then we can talk about the upside. So nicotine, it does impact your brain's reward system. And so what that means is when you are stimulating more dopamine, that leads to some downregulation of your body's own reward system, which can lead to dependence, especially if you're using it in higher doses. And so what's a high dose of nicotine? Well, it's dependent on everybody. I think anything over about maybe 12 milligrams a day is way too high. And anything more than about 3 milligrams in a setting is probably about the most. And you're going to want to titrate it. So the smaller that you can, the lower the dose, the better. And that's how you can help create an environment where you don't get dependent on it. Nicotine, that you're doing it at the right dose when you have days where you forget. And so that's always kind of in mind where I'm like, oh, I haven't done nicotine for a month. I forgot about it, with my toothpicks or getting back into it a little more these days. I'm like, oh, I forget often. So, it's a big deal, and you probably need to put it away if you're thinking about it all the time, or, if you're noticing that it just becomes a distraction for you. But with that said, for those of you who are like, well, what's a peptide that is comparable to? Well, there's some great synergies between like Dihexa. And so for those of you who don't even want to venture into the world of dependency, because there are people who, even if they're using the right type of nicotine, they do develop a dependency, and then you'll notice they get kind of edgy. And I don't want anyone in our community edgy. And so that's where you definitely, you just got to know when to say when. Talk to your spouse, talk to people who are close with you, let them know that you're experimenting with it. And hopefully they are open-minded enough to realize it's a natural thing. And so if you can use Dihexa, same kind of neuroprotection, cognitive function. Semax is another one of those peptides that you can use, a nasal spray. But nicotine, because it's around a lot, one of the downsides that you'll find is it can cause a little bit of nausea. It can also cause some acid reflux. And you'll notice if you ever use nicotine and you just notice that you get kind of some acidity in your upper chest, there's a good chance that you don't have good vagal tone. And so you're stimulating your sympathetic nervous system too much. And that means that nicotine is not for you. And so that requires you to go back and really get your parasympathetic nervous system more balanced so that you can push on the gas and you can push on the brake. And what that means is eating in a non-stressed state, giving your body 20 minutes to eat, thoroughly chewing your food, and then only eat until you're 80% full. My Japanese teacher used to just thrive on this idea that we overeat is the greatest sin you can commit on your body. So if you think about, with nicotine, if you're noticing any kind of adverse issues in your stomach, you probably introduced it too soon. So, all right. So those are the downsides. And, the downside will occur if you're using these nicotine molecules from sources that aren't clean. And so some of the best sources, like the Lucy brand, seems to have really good clean ingredients. Knick-Knack seems to be another one that has, seems to be really clean. And then there's another brand called EFX. And EFX is also third-party tested. There's no heavy metals, no lead, no formaldehyde. You will have some flavors. Usually they're, stevia-based, and you can put a little pouch on your upper lip or lower lip, and that's how you can get the best absorption. Knick-Knack makes these little mints, and those mints are pretty good. And so that's how you can try it. And EFX and Lucy comes in 4 milligrams, 8 milligrams, 12, 16. And then like Knick-Knack comes in like 3, 6s, probably 12s. I stick to the lowest possible if I'm ever using nicotine. So, and then there's patches. And one of the things about the patches is they can have some residue. So ideally you want organic patches, and so those are fine. But the patches, in some of the studies conducted, they don't quite have the same benefits. So I know if you're getting up smoking, it can be helpful, but most of the research that they found is the oral use of nicotine is just far better for the brain and so many other things. So let's talk about, hopefully that answers those two questions. Downsides first. Don't use this. If you have any reservations, do not use it. And that's where I kind of wanted to do a survey to see if you guys are even interested in this. But for the upside, which, you have to weigh this. And this is where everything in life, everything in medicine, everything that you do in life, you just have to say, like, is this going to be something that might be beneficial? And you guys know I'm a big believer in cycling things in. So peptide stacking, you don't want to stay on virtually anything long term. Maybe some of the supplements that you genetically are predisposed to having deficiencies in, like in my case, methylated B vitamins and vitamin D. Those are things those are fine. I just supplement those pretty much all the time unless I forget. But peptides, I'm continually cycling. Nicotine is something you want to cycle. It's a nootropic. So it's going to have diminishing returns, just like anything else if you take it on the regular. And if you exceed microdosing it, then it may lead to a dependency, but there's dependencies on everything in life. But nicotine, because it works on dopamine, seems to be one of the biggest. So here's one of the studies. In this study, I can put this in the notes so that you can reference some of these things. And as you have questions, feel free to ask me, and I'll answer them the best I can. But this is investigating medicinal nicotine to prevent and treat COVID-19. And so what they found is that, smoking, there's no therapeutic rule, but medicinal nicotine, is FDA approved, inexpensive, over the counter, readily available therapy that does seem to have a long-standing safety record. And there's a lot of great research on this. You're not going to find it on Google. It's all going to be like real garbage. So here's what they found is that with some of the benefits of nicotine, they found that it is plausible that people who utilize nicotine had a lower rate of the SARS-CoV-2 infection. And they also found that medicinal nicotine can help, especially for those who don't smoke. And so what it's been reported is that the nicotine, it helps decrease the level of what's called angiotensin converting enzyme 2. And remember, Dihexa is working on that same pathway. That's why I brought Dihexa into the conversations. There's an alternative if you're trying to prevent some of these infections. But they found that if nicotine, based on the fact that it does seem to lower this angiotensin converting enzyme 2 expression, that denies the viral particles entry into the cells. And so that will reduce the SARS-CoV-2 infection rates. And so if you can keep the viruses from penetrating the cell, then for people who have long COVID, and I've had very close patients who we've gotten them to a certain level and they've gotten 90% better. And all right, there's one thing, and it's always an uncomfortable conversation. It's like, well, have you considered nicotine? Like, I've been reading about that. And so they're usually relieved. So, and I think people, there's a lot more out there on this. And so, oh, good. Christy, thank you. Nicotine's been so incredibly helpful to me. So glad to hear you discussing this. And please, if you don't mind sharing details on how it's been helpful, love to hear people. I'd also love to hear people who say, man, I tried it because I read all these cool things about it, and I just did not do well. I didn't sleep. I had all these things. And so maybe we could, I'd love to have a conversation about it. But one of the studies, another study published in Science Direct. What they found is that nicotine influences a wide variety of cognitive function like attention, learning, and memory. And it's also been found to improve cognitive impairment in these chronic diseases, like I mentioned before, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and then age-associated memory impairment, schizophrenia, stroke, autism, and even attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And here's the problem in the school districts, these damn vapes, and pardon my French, but I get so frustrated when you see, I have clients who have kids. I had a boy that got into vaping for a minute there, and I was just, it's so deceptive because it's got this cloud of like this nice cotton candy or whatever the sweet smell is. And the vape it helps kids who have ADHD. And so it's just a trap that kids get stuck in where they're using this really negative type of nicotine that does have formaldehyde, it does have heavy metals, and that's when it becomes a lot more addictive, is when you have other chemicals combined with the nicotine. In fact, if you look at tobacco, even the damage to tobacco, the real cancer came once the big tobacco companies got pretty sloppy in their processing, and they started having more chemical laden tobacco and spraying all the pesticides on it, the herbicides. Those just harbored heavy metals, and they made things really addictive. So there's some interesting things now that what we're realizing is that, man, if we can use nicotine in its more pure form, you're going to see a much better improvement in brain health. And so, okay, appreciate that. You said, so Christy, it increased brain function, your attention and memory at the same time, reduced anxiety significantly, a total win. And I would have to say that one of the biggest things that I found too is even when I was using those toothpicks, they had like, is such a small, you could just do a little tiny tip of it. I don't know where they are now, but if anyone knows, I'd love to. I'm sure someone's making them somewhere, but I noticed when I was writing, I was able to just go deep into flow state and write so much more prolifically. So I think that is, there's some big benefits for it. And so Chris, you're asking, are there any without the sugar alcohols? And this is where there are unsweetened. I think I've seen it in Knick Knack. I don't know that Lucy has it, but I don't know if I'm aware of anything that doesn't use sugar, kind of some of those sugar alcohols. And so if anyone knows, feel free to help out here. Love to know. And I can do a quick search and find out. But the interesting thing is in nicotine, because it's had such a bad rap for so long. It's actually, if you think about, well, what is nicotine anyway? Nicotine is it's a B vitamin, kind of a precursor to B vitamin, and it does, it's found in a lot of different foods. And yeah, I'm looking at this, but there's a lot that use some very nasty artificial sweeteners that aren't sugar alcohols. But yeah, I don't know. I would just look for the ones that aren't sweetened, and that is your best bet there. But anyway, back to talking about some of the foods that we've seen. Well, tomatoes, they have nicotine. Eggplants, nicotine. Potatoes, nicotine. I mean, you even think, certain types of mushrooms, there's a little bit of nicotine. Nicotine is going to be found in like your green peppers. It's found in cauliflower. And so, there's just like caffeine is, naturally occurs in many places, like in our coffee. But, one of the studies, they compared the addictive side of nicotine to caffeine, and they found that, they're both very, they're pretty well tolerated. And actually, caffeine has a longer half-life. And so caffeine may actually be a little more dependent related than even nicotine. And so, some of the things that you'll see is with nicotine, it can help with bowel movements. So if you do suffer from like chronic constipation, and yes, we have our bowel mover formula, which I know many of you are big fans of, but yeah, it can help get the bowel movements going. It can help with inflammation, helps fight against the CoV-2, so it doesn't allow the viruses to get into the cell, helps with Alzheimer's. It can help with anxiety, depression. It can also create more anxiety if you don't need it, and helps with ADHD. And so my big challenge to you guys is, maybe look into it yourself and do your own due diligence, research it. But I can tell you that in hundreds, if not thousands of studies, you're going to find that, it's what we put with the nicotine is what makes this beautiful molecule a lot more dangerous. And if you say, well, I don't want to enter down that pathway, but I still want the benefits, that's where Dihexa is probably the closest thing to nicotine that you're going to find. And so hopefully this has been helpful to you. And once again, this is for your own discretion. Talk to your provider about this before you jump into it. And then, like I said, have a support network around you. Say, hey, I'm going to be trying this. And here's kind of the downside. I might get, if I'm going to limit myself to, 10, 12 milligrams. I'm going to do small amounts, and I'm only going to do it every every other day, or take a 2-day break in between, whatever it may be. But just kind of set up some parameters and think of this as just one more tool in your cognitive enhancement toolbox that might actually be really good for you. So appreciate you guys. Next week, we'll dive into exosomes, stem cells, all kinds of cool stuff. And if you guys have not, I know we've had several of you email asking to be on the list to get the personal invitation for our cognitive enhancement day, East West, where we're going to do the neurocatch. We do a neural analysis. We do some brain upgrades throughout the day. We take you through these thought processes and writing processes and journaling, where you create frameworks for yourself. We help you capture and restore your focus again, because your memory is not going to improve if you can't pay attention. And so we get your attention back. So you'll get an upgrade in your brain by about a 50% improvement in focus, 50% improvement in your body's or your brain's ability to remember things. And we'll show you some nice little hacks of improving that. So, and then we're going to have a before and after test. So if you guys are interested, you can email Regan, Regan, at eastwest.com, or Cade, Cade, at AcuEastWest. So, all right, your challenge for this week is either try Dihexa if you want to work on the angiotensin pathway and get a nice nootropic benefit, or consider getting some kind of natural nicotine. Try it out. All right. Appreciate you guys.